The Civil War marks a tumultuous time in our nation's history, when Americans fought against one another in an ideological battle that would come to mark one of the great turning points for our nation. In the Civil War, we can think of many military actions, both moral and immoral, that were committed on both sides, Union and Confederate. One such action in particular is that of General William Tecumseh Sherman, a Union general well known for his Savannah campaign, also known as Sherman's March to the Sea. From a Confederate perspective, Sherman's military action in this case paints him as a villain, a war criminal guilty of rampaging through the countryside, taking whatever he could in his path, and ruining the lives of civilians in the process. From a Union perspective, Sherman brought a swift end to the war, and one that may not otherwise have happened had it not been for his campaign. Ultimately, by looking at his early upbringing as a man of deep moral character, his personal convictions and deep concern for those in the South, as well as other military actions in which he was involved, it becomes evident that Sherman was both legally and morally justified in his actions during his march to the sea. In looking at him historically, it's important to view him as a hero of not only the Union cause, but indeed the American cause, as his efforts to save lives on both sides of the battlefield proved to bring a more swift end to the Civil War. But first, it becomes necessary to take a look at Sherman's early life. He was born the 6th of 11 children to a family in Lancaster, Ohio. In his early life, his father died at a very young age, and his mother was unable to take care of all the children. As a result, Sherman went to go live with his foster family, who turned out to be his next-door neighbors, the Ewing family. And in his personal memoirs, he writes what a profound effect this family had on his early development. Specifically, the head of the household, Mr. Thomas Ewing. So Mr. Ewing was a prominent businessman in Lancaster and eventually a Republican senator for the state of Ohio and the first Secretary of the Interior. Sherman writes in his personal memoirs that Ewing's sense of honor and his tolerant views of others influenced him and caused him at a very young age to be very tolerant and appreciative of others and what they would do. Additionally, he learned political attitudes from Mr. Ewing that would later go on to affect him in his choice to enter the Civil War on the side of the Union. Ewing thought that nullification amounted to a declaration of war, and that, quote, the allegiance which a citizen owes to his state must yield to that paramount allegiance which he owes to the Union. So this would come to dictate Sherman's political views, especially as he served as a Union general later on in the war. So knowing a little bit about the way he grew up, we can take a look at his prior military record in order to determine whether or not the actions he took during his march through Georgia were morally justified. In September of 1864, Atlanta fell to Union forces under the command of General Sherman, and many originally thought that once Atlanta fell, Sherman and his men would take everything they could from the town, ransack it, and terrorize the civilians within Atlanta. However, this wasn't the case. Sherman ordered that his men destroy several key military targets within the city, but then he actually put out an order stating that all civilians must leave Atlanta. Some people on both sides were a little bit concerned that perhaps he was doing this out of selfishness for his troops, that he could keep everything for himself and his men. However, ultimately, his actions potentially shielded 705 adults, 860 children, and 79 slaves from the continued horrors of war that would plague Atlanta as the Confederates tried to take it back over. Additionally, during the fight for Atlanta, Sherman wrote to a longtime friend, a woman whom he knew during the time he spent as a young military officer down in Louisiana. He wrote, "My heart bleeds when I see the carnage of battle, the desolation of homes, the bitter anguish of families. But we have to continue so that our common country should not perish in infamy and dishonor." In this particular action, Sherman showed that he cared about the civilian population and wanted to try to protect them as much as he possibly could from the horrors of continued war during the Civil War. After it became evident in the fall of 1864 that regardless of the fall of Atlanta, the Confederates would continue to fight tooth and nail to the very bitter end, Sherman began planning his march through Georgia to Savannah. In planning his march, Sherman put out an order to his men, and in the initial order, he stated that the men of his army should forage liberally on the country during the march, but that soldiers were not allowed to enter the dwellings of the inhabitants or commit any trespass. Additionally, officers were the only men allowed to order the destruction of property, and only in cases of guerrilla warfare from Confederate forces. He also wrote that in districts and neighborhoods where the army is unmolested, no destruction of property should be permitted. Now, we all know the facts. There were cases in which soldiers went too far. They took more than they should have. Although history paints sort of a different picture of the March to the Sea, and they say that there was a lot of rape that was committed and things of that nature. There were only 2 confirmed cases of rape along the March to the Sea, and Sherman was in command of a very, very large force. So he did everything in his power to try to ensure that the men followed his instructions. In fact, during the march, Sherman reprimanded men in his army who took too much. In one case in his memoirs, he writes about a man who passed him with a ham on his musket, some molasses under one arm, and honey under the other arm. And he remarked to one of his comrades carelessly, "Forage liberally on the country." Sherman immediately got off of his horse, went over the man, reprimanded him for what he had done, saying that he took far too much, and made him give all the goods to his immediate commanding officer so that it could be equally distributed among the men of his unit. Sherman openly wished that there was another way to achieve the ends that he was looking to achieve. Specifically, every time he would meet a Southerner along the March to the Sea, he would tell them, "I pledge you that my study is to accomplish peace and honor at as small a cost to life and property as possible, and that I will take infinitely more delight in curing the wounds made by war than by inflicting them." So by these actions, we see that Sherman cared deeply about the lives not only of the civilians, but the loss of life that was being incurred on both sides of the battlefield, and he wanted to end the conflict as swiftly as he possibly could. If we take a look at the standing legal codes of the time in terms of warfare, and additionally just war theory, we also see that Sherman was not only legally justified in his actions, but morally justified in his actions as well. The standing code of the time, the Lieber Code, was drafted by a professor of Columbia College. And in Article 21 of that code, it says, "The citizen or native of a hostile country is thus an enemy, as one of the constituents of the hostile state or nation, and as such is subjected to the hardships of war." The people in Georgia were subjected to the hardships of war, but Sherman tried to minimize his destruction as much as he could. Per just war theory, military forces are allowed to attack the infrastructure of the enemy, and that's exactly what Sherman and his men did. In conclusion, Sherman should be considered a hero of war, and indeed a hero of the American cause. Noted Sherman historian John Marsalic says, "Sherman was determined to save lives by using destruction to break the Southern will and end the war as quickly as possible. He did not destroy because he was a brute. He destroyed to save lives."